This just in, a warning that sounds less like analysis and more like a prophecy is beginning to echo across geopolitical circles, and it is sending shockwaves through Washington, Tehran, and every capital watching this unfold. Every empire that attacked Iran died there. Let that sink in. This is not a slogan. This is not social media noise. This is a historical pattern being revived in real time. And now, some analysts are asking a chilling question. Is America walking into the same trap? Because here's what just changed. In recent weeks, tensions surrounding Iran have escalated in ways that feel different, not routine, not cyclical, but structural, strategic, almost irreversible. Military posturing has intensified, economic pressure has tightened, diplomatic language has hardened, and behind all of this, there is a growing narrative being pushed by scholars like Professor Jiang Xueqin, that history may not just be repeating itself, it may be warning us. Think about that for a second. Empires far more dominant than modern America, empires that controlled continents, trade routes, and entire civilizations tried to subdue Persia, modern-day Iran, and one by one, they failed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, gradually, until the cost became unbearable. And now, here we are again. The United States, the most powerful military force on the planet, is increasingly entangled in a confrontation with Iran that is no longer just about sanctions or regional influence. It is becoming something deeper, something more dangerous, something that history suggests does not end well. But here is the part nobody is talking about. This isn't just about Iran's strength. It's about its geography, its strategy, its patience, and its ability to outlast, outmaneuver, and exhaust even the most powerful adversaries. Iran doesn't need to win quickly. It doesn't need to dominate globally. It just needs to survive and wait. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because if this pattern is real, if history truly shows that every empire that tried to break Iran ended up breaking itself, then what we are witnessing right now is not just another geopolitical standoff. It is the opening chapter of something much bigger, something that could redefine power in the 21st century, something that could test the limits of American dominance like never before. And the question is no longer hypothetical. The question now is simple and deeply unsettling. Is the United States stepping into a historical cycle it cannot escape? Or is this the moment where history is finally broken? Because to understand the warning, you have to understand the moment. Over the past several months, the situation between the United States and Iran has shifted from controlled tension to something far more volatile. This isn't just rhetoric anymore. This isn't just diplomatic signaling. This is movement, real, measurable, strategic movement. We're seeing increased military deployments across the Middle East. We're seeing naval assets repositioned near critical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage through which nearly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day. Think about that. One narrow corridor, and the global economy depends on it. Now ask yourself, what happens if that corridor becomes unstable? Oil prices spike, supply chains fracture, markets panic, inflation surges globally, and suddenly a regional conflict becomes a worldwide economic shock. But here is where things get serious. Iran is not just reacting, Iran is preparing. Behind the scenes, Tehran has been strengthening its asymmetric warfare capabilities, missile systems, drone technology, cyber operations, and most importantly, its network of regional alliances. From non-state actors to aligned militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond, Iran has built a web of influence that doesn't look like traditional military power, but operates with precision and deniability. And this is where the strategy changes. Because the United States fights wars with overwhelming force, rapid dominance, and technological superiority. But Iran plays a different game entirely. A slower game, a longer game, a game designed not to win quickly, but to make victory impossible for the opponent. Let me explain what this means. If a direct confrontation were to occur, it wouldn't look like past wars. There would be no clear battlefield, no decisive opening strike that ends everything. Instead, it would unfold across multiple fronts: economic, cyber, maritime, and proxy conflicts all at once. And every move would carry a cost, not just in dollars, but in time, in political capital, in global credibility. Now think about the position of the United States. After 2 decades of costly engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost, and outcomes that remain deeply debated, there is already fatigue, strategic fatigue, public fatigue, even institutional fatigue. And yet, Here comes another potential confrontation, another complex, deeply entrenched, geographically challenging opponent, another situation where the exit strategy is unclear from the beginning. But here is the part nobody is talking about. Iran doesn't need to defeat the United States militarily to claim victory. It just needs to drag the conflict out. It just needs to increase the cost. It just needs to make staying more painful than leaving. Think about that for a second, because that is exactly how stronger powers have been worn down throughout history, not by direct defeat, but by slow erosion, by overextension, by the accumulation of pressure over time. And this is why that warning, every empire that attacked Iran died there, is gaining attention again. Because when you look at what's happening right now, it doesn't feel like a sudden crisis. It feels like the beginning of a pattern that has played out before, a pattern that, once it starts, becomes very difficult to stop. And this is where the story takes a turn, because the real question is not just what is happening on the surface. Why are serious analysts, historians, and strategists starting to treat this moment not as just another geopolitical flare-up, but as something far more dangerous? Let me explain what this means, because this isn't just about a potential conflict between the United States and Iran. This is about the stability of the entire global system, the economic order, the balance of power, and the credibility of American dominance itself. Think about that for a second. For decades, the United States has operated as the central pillar of the global order. Its currency anchors international trade. Its military secures key shipping lanes. Its alliances shape political outcomes across continents. That system only works if one assumption holds true, that American power is decisive, reliable, and ultimately uncontested. But what happens if that assumption starts to crack? What happens if a confrontation with Iran turns into a prolonged, unresolved struggle? Because here is where things get serious. Iran is not just another regional player. It sits at the crossroads of energy, geography, and history. Any disruption involving Iran doesn't stay local. It radiates outward. Oil markets react instantly. Shipping insurance rates skyrocket. Investors pull back. Currencies fluctuate. Entire economies feel the shock. We're talking about a potential chain reaction. A disruption in the Strait of Hormuz alone could send oil prices soaring beyond $150 per barrel. Let that sink in. That's not just a number. That's higher fuel costs, higher transportation costs, rising food prices, and inflation hitting households across the world. And it doesn't stop there, because the political consequences could be even more significant. Allies of the United States would be forced into difficult decisions. Do they fully support Washington and risk economic backlash? Or do they try to balance relations and avoid getting pulled into a prolonged conflict? Meanwhile, rivals are watching very closely. Countries like China and Russia are not passive observers. They are strategic thinkers. They understand that if the United States becomes deeply tied down in another complex regional confrontation, its ability to project power elsewhere becomes limited. Think about what that means. Less focus in Eastern Europe, less presence in the Indo-Pacific, less flexibility in global diplomacy, and suddenly a regional conflict starts to shift the global balance of power. But here's the part nobody is talking about. This isn't just about what happens if the United States loses. It's about what happens if the United States cannot win quickly. Because in today's world, perception matters as much as reality. If the most powerful country on Earth struggles to achieve clear objectives against a regional power, that sends a signal to allies, to rivals, to markets, to everyone. It raises questions. Is American power still as overwhelming as it once was? Is the global system as stable as we believed? And most importantly, who benefits from that uncertainty? Let me say this again because it's important. In a prolonged conflict, there are no clean victories. There are only shifting costs, evolving narratives, and gradual changes in influence. And Iran understands this better than most. It doesn't need to defeat the United States in a conventional sense. It just needs to challenge the idea that the United States cannot be challenged. Think about that. Because once that perception changes, everything changes. And this is where the story deepens. Because to understand how we got here, you have to look at the strategy behind it all. What is each side really trying to do? Because if you only look at the headlines, you miss the game entirely. Let me explain what this means. On the surface, it looks like a familiar pattern. Pressure from the United States, resistance from Iran, rising tensions, military positioning. But underneath that surface, there is a calculated, layered strategy unfolding on both sides. And this is where things get serious. The United States is operating from a position it has relied on for decades: maximum pressure. Economic sanctions designed to weaken Iran's economy, diplomatic isolation intended to limit its global reach, military deterrence to prevent escalation. In theory, it's a powerful combination: cut off financial flows, restrict oil exports, freeze assets. Pressure allies to comply, and eventually the target either changes behavior or collapses under the weight of that pressure. But here is the part nobody is talking about. Iran has adapted. Over years of sanctions, Iran has restructured parts of its economy to survive under pressure. Informal trade networks, regional partnerships, alternative financial channels. This is not a country experiencing pressure for the first time. This is a system that has learned how to function inside it. Think about that for a second. What happens when a strategy designed to force change meets a system designed to resist it? You don't get quick results. You get a stalemate. And in that stalemate, the dynamics begin to shift. Now look at Iran's strategy. Iran does not seek direct confrontation with the United States in the traditional sense. That would be catastrophic. Instead, it operates through what analysts call asymmetric warfare, using indirect methods to offset the overwhelming military advantage of its opponent. Proxy networks, cyber capabilities, strategic geography, psychological pressure, and most importantly, time. Let that sink in, because time is Iran's greatest weapon. The longer a confrontation lasts, the more variables enter the equation. Political cycles change, public opinion shifts, economic pressures accumulate, alliances strain, and slowly the balance begins to tilt, not because one side is stronger, but because one side is more patient. And this is where the story takes a turn, because the United States is not just dealing with Iran, it is dealing with a system of interconnected pressures, energy markets that react instantly, regional actors that can escalate independently, global rivals like China and Russia who may not intervene directly, but benefit strategically from prolonged instability. Think about what that means. Every additional day of tension creates opportunities, not just risks. Opportunities for competitors to expand influence, opportunities for alternative alliances to form, opportunities for the global order to slowly, quietly begin to shift. But here is the most critical point. This is not a strategy designed to deliver a dramatic victory. This is a strategy designed to create a situation where victory becomes undefined, where success is unclear, where objectives evolve, where costs continue without resolution. And history has shown something very important about these kinds of situations. Powerful nations don't collapse because they lose one battle. They weaken because they stay in conflicts that have no clear end. They stretch resources. They divide attention. They erode internally. Think about that, because if this really is the strategy unfolding right now, then what we are witnessing is not just tension, it is positioning. Positioning for a conflict that may never be officially declared, but is constantly being fought. And that leads us to the next question. How is the world reacting to this? Because when tensions rise to this level, when strategies begin to collide in slow motion, the fallout doesn't wait for a formal conflict. It starts immediately. And this is where things get serious. Global markets are already behaving differently. Energy traders are watching every movement near the Strait of Hormuz like it's a ticking clock. Even the slightest disruption, one incident, one miscalculation, one escalation, can send shockwaves through oil prices within hours. Think about that for a second. Entire economies reacting, not to war itself, but to the possibility of war. That's how fragile the situation has become. And it's not just markets. Political leaders across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are recalibrating their positions. Some are calling for restraint. Others are quietly preparing contingency plans, because nobody wants to be caught off guard if this situation spirals. But here is the part nobody is talking about. There is no unified global response, and that matters more than people realize. In previous eras, major international crises often triggered coordinated reactions, alliances moving together, institutions stepping in, diplomatic frameworks activating. But today, the world is more fragmented, more divided, more uncertain. Allies of the United States are not all aligned on how far to go. Some support pressure on Iran, but fear the economic consequences of escalation. Others are trying to maintain a balance, engaging diplomatically while avoiding direct confrontation. And then there are the global powers watching from the sidelines. China continues to expand its economic footprint, particularly in energy markets. Any disruption in supply creates both risk and opportunity. Lower prices in one moment, strategic leverage in the next. Russia, already deeply involved in its own geopolitical struggles, understands the value of distraction. A United States focused on Iran is a United States with limited bandwidth elsewhere. Let that sink in, because this isn't just about reactions, it's about positioning. Every country, every leader, every institution is asking the same question. If this escalates, where do we stand? And this is where the fallout becomes more complex. Public opinion. Inside the United States, there is no clear appetite for another prolonged conflict. The memories of past wars are still fresh. The economic pressures at home are real. Inflation, debt, domestic divisions, all of these factors shape how any new confrontation is perceived. Now think about what that means. A government trying to project strength abroad while managing skepticism at home. That's not a simple equation. And in Iran, the dynamic is different, but equally powerful. External pressure often reinforces internal unity. The more a country feels threatened from the outside, the more it consolidates internally. That's a pattern seen repeatedly throughout history. So instead of weakening resolve, pressure can sometimes strengthen it. And this is where the story takes another turn, because the fallout we're seeing now, market anxiety, political hesitation, strategic positioning, is only the beginning. These are early signals, early indicators of a system adjusting to stress. But what happens when that stress increases? What happens when one incident becomes two, and two becomes a chain reaction? Because at that point, it's no longer about managing fallout. It's about controlling escalation. And history tells us something very uncomfortable. Escalation is easy to start, but incredibly difficult to stop. Think about that. Because once events begin to move faster than decision-making, once reactions replace strategy, once pressure overrides caution, that's when situations spiral. And that's why this moment matters so much. Because what we are seeing right now is not the peak of the crisis. It's the buildup, the slow accumulation of pressure before something breaks. And when it does, it doesn't just affect one region, it reshapes the entire global picture. Which brings us to the most important part of this story. And this is where the story becomes even more significant. What we are witnessing is not just a potential conflict between the United States and Iran. It is a stress test of the entire global order. Let me explain what this means. For decades, the world has operated under a system largely shaped by American power, military, economic, and institutional. Trade routes secured, alliances maintained, conflicts managed within certain boundaries. But that system is no longer as stable as it once was. New powers are rising, old assumptions are being challenged, and the margin for error is shrinking. Think about that for a second. At the same time that tensions with Iran are increasing, the United States is also navigating strategic competition with China, managing ongoing geopolitical friction involving Russia, and maintaining commitments across Europe, Asia, and beyond. That's not just complexity, that's overload. And history has shown something very clear. No empire, no matter how powerful, can manage unlimited pressure across multiple fronts indefinitely. Let that sink in, because this is where the warning begins to make sense. When analysts say that empires that attacked Iran ultimately declined, they are not just talking about battlefield outcomes. They are talking about overextension. They are talking about strategic exhaustion. They are talking about the slow shift from dominance to vulnerability. And this is where things get serious. Iran sits in a position that amplifies all of these pressures. It connects energy flows, regional dynamics, and great power competition into one single nook of tension. Any escalation involving Iran doesn't just stay contained, it intersects with everything else. Energy markets, alliance structures, military deployments, diplomatic priorities, it all converges here. Now think about what that means. If the United States becomes deeply engaged in a prolonged confrontation with Iran, it doesn't just affect one region, it affects its ability to respond elsewhere. Less flexibility in Asia, more pressure in Europe, more opportunities for competitors to act, and slowly, almost quietly, the balance begins to shift. But here's the part nobody is talking about. This shift doesn't happen overnight. There is no single moment where everything changes. Instead, it happens gradually, one decision at a time, one crisis layered on top of another. One resource stretched a little further than before, until eventually, the system starts to strain. And when systems strain, they don't always break dramatically. Sometimes they just stop holding everything together. Think about that. Because this is not just about conflict. It is about capacity. How much pressure can a global superpower absorb before it starts to lose control of the broader system it built? And that is the real question at the center of this story. Not just whether the United States can confront Iran, but whether it can do so without triggering a larger transformation in the global order. And this is where the story reaches its most uncertain phase, because once you understand the bigger picture, you realize something important. The future is no longer predictable. Multiple scenarios are now possible. Multiple outcomes are now in play, and none of them are simple. There are multiple paths forward, multiple scenarios, and each one carries its own risks, its own consequences, its own version of the future. Let me explain what this means, because from this point on, events don't follow a straight line, they branch out. Scenario 1, controlled tension. In this path, the United States and Iran continue what they are doing right now. Pressure, counter-pressure, strategic signaling, but stop short of direct confrontation. No major escalation, no full-scale conflict, just a prolonged standoff. At first, that might sound like the safest outcome, but think about it for a second. A long-term standoff still carries costs. Markets remain unstable. Energy prices stay volatile. Military resources remain tied down. Political focus remains divided. And over time, that pressure accumulates. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. Scenario 2, limited escalation. This is where things start to get dangerous. An incident, maybe in the Strait of Hormuz, maybe through a proxy conflict, triggers a direct response. Not a full war, but a series of strikes, counterstrikes, and rapid escalation cycles. Now ask yourself, can something like that be easily contained? History suggests not always, because once actions begin to trigger reactions, control becomes harder. Each side tries to signal strength without going too far, but the line between controlled and uncontrolled is thin, very thin. Scenario 3, full-scale confrontation. This is the scenario everyone hopes to avoid, but cannot ignore. A direct military conflict between the United States and Iran would not be quick, it would not be clean, and it would not be limited to one battlefield. It would spread across domains: air, sea, cyber, and regional networks. Energy flows disrupted, global markets shaken, alliances tested. And here is the part nobody is talking about. Even in this scenario, victory is not clearly defined. Yes, the United States has overwhelming military power. But Iran has strategic depth, geography, and asymmetric capabilities that make rapid victory extremely difficult. And that means one thing: time. Time becomes the deciding factor. And as we've seen, time does not always favor the stronger power. Let that sink in. Scenario 4, strategic shift. This is the least discussed, but potentially the most important. Instead of escalation, both sides gradually shift strategy. Indirect engagement replaces direct confrontation. New diplomatic channels emerge. Economic and regional dynamics reshape the relationship. Not peace, but recalibration. And in that recalibration, something larger could happen. A redefinition of influence in the Middle East. A shift in how power is projected. A gradual movement away from confrontation, toward coexistence under tension. Think about what that means, because sometimes the biggest changes don't come from war. They come from adaptation, from recognizing limits, from adjusting strategy before the cost becomes too high. But here is the reality. Right now, all of these scenarios are possible, and they are not mutually exclusive. Events could move from one path to another quickly, unpredictably, and that uncertainty is what makes this moment so critical. Because when the future is unclear, decisions become more difficult. Risks become harder to calculate. Mistakes become more likely. And this is where the story reaches its peak tension, because everything we've discussed, history, strategy, global pressure, systemic strain, it all leads to this point, a moment where the next move matters more than ever, a moment where one decision could shift everything. And this is where the story becomes personal, because this isn't just about the United States or Iran, it's about the kind of world we are moving into. Let me explain what this means. For decades, global stability has depended on a fragile balance, power strong enough to deter conflict but controlled enough to avoid it, a system where escalation had limits, where major confrontations were managed before they spiraled out of control. But what happens when those limits start to fade? What happens when multiple pressures, economic, political, military, all begin to converge at the same time? Think about that for a second, because that's exactly what we're seeing right now. A situation where no side can easily back down, but no side can afford to fully escalate. A situation where every move carries risk, but inaction carries its own consequences. And this is where the warning we started with comes back into focus. Every empire that attacked Iran died there, not necessarily in one decisive moment, not in one catastrophic defeat, but through a process of overreach, a process of prolonged engagement, a process where the cost of staying became greater than the cost of leaving, but leaving itself came too late. Let that sink in, because the real danger is not always obvious. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's gradual. Sometimes it's the slow accumulation of decisions that seem manageable in the moment, but irreversible in hindsight. And this is where the final question emerges. Is the United States aware of this pattern? Is it adjusting its strategy to avoid it? Or is it moving forward, step by step, into a situation that history has already warned about? Think about what that means, because if history is any guide, the outcome is not determined by strength alone. It's determined by judgment, by timing, by the ability to recognize when a strategy is no longer working, and change course before the cost becomes too high. And that's the real test, not just of power, but of leadership, not just of capability, but of restraint. Because in a world like this, the greatest victories are not always the ones fought and won on the battlefield. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones where conflict is avoided altogether. But here is the uncomfortable truth. We don't yet know which path this moment will take. We don't know whether this tension will stabilize, escalate, or transform into something entirely different. All we know is that the stakes are enormous. Global stability, economic security, the balance of power in the 21st century, it's all connected to what happens next. And that brings us back to you, because in moments like this, awareness matters, understanding matters, asking the right questions matters. So here's the question I want you to think about. If history is sending a warning, will it be heard this time? Or are we watching the beginning of a cycle that no one can stop once it truly begins?